All right, this is wonderful. So we have a full 40 minutes for Q&A with the panel, and as moderator, I'll just start us off with a question. So this is a question for, I think, Bhavin and Danielle and Margaret. You know, whether you're looking at the association between NIH funding and patenting, or you're looking at the causal effect of NIH funding on patenting, it does seem that many of us want to know whether the patent was, was this a patent that was actually the pivotal patent? Was it a patent that was absolutely necessary for this therapeutic to come to market, or was it sufficient that with this single patent I could have, that's probably maybe too sharp of a point, but how do I think about that challenge? Because I realize you haven't addressed it, but how do we go about addressing the importance of the patent? Please.
Okay, yeah, so I pushed.
It's the little face that's talking that you have to push down below. No, it's down below, Bhavin.
I see, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. I patented that.
You did? But was it crucial? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyhow, we could go on forever. So yeah, good question. I mean, I talked about cruciality or pivotalness with respect to publications, but you could ask the same with respect to patents. So on average, there's if you count both the Orange Book and kind of other sources like IMS patent data, you get to 8 patents. There's more patents on average for biologics than for small molecule drugs. On the Orange Book, there's about 3.5 patents on average per drug. Okay, so I think the way I would do this, and I've looked at this a little bit, just not when I showed you, is the extent to which the active ingredient patent comes from the public sector, essentially, right? The main patent, and there's ways to know that. It looks like about where you see this direct linkage, about 48% of the time, maybe half the time, let's say, it is in fact the active ingredient. So in Zalatan, it was the main patent. What's interesting, and it was actually kind of surprising to me when I saw it, is that the public sector is also involved in taking out use patents, used for particular indications and things like that. And that was kind of surprising to me as well. And yeah, so I think you'd want to, in future analyses, unpack those two things because obviously the implications are very different. Yeah.
Got it.
But that's how, I've looked at it quickly, but that's how I would look at it systematically going forward. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And then, Dr. Woodcock, before I hand it over to the audience, you made a very powerful, I heard it as a powerful appeal that the hard work we're doing in translational science start to also think about the translational science that could maybe enhance or accelerate regulatory science. That's how I heard it. You didn't exactly use those words, so I apologize if I got that wrong. So I wrote down validated biomarkers. I wrote down things like the measurement of outcomes, the sustainability of response, trial design. But you also made this point that this is not maybe what academics are rewarded to do. So if academics aren't rewarded to do it, let's just take that as a given. We should maybe explore that. Simply coming along with more money is not going to produce that science that we need. And so I'm wondering whether it should be done intramurally by the government. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on sort of doing more translational research intramurally with a particular emphasis on regulatory science, simply because the academics may not do it.
Yeah, well, I don't like to use the word regulatory science because it implies some kind of lesser kind of science. Okay, we're talking about science here, okay, but we're talking about a different kind of science than pathways and molecular biology and so forth. I really think I agree with Chris. You need a lot of, it's an interdisciplinary activity, and you need a lot of people from different sectors. NIH has been rather successful in some of its public-private partnerships that it is putting on recently that bring the pharmaceutical industry, and together with NIH, they're putting in money, everybody's putting in money, and they have common objectives, and everything will be made public, okay? But the idea, so I agree, I believe that scientists all over this country and doctors who are in academia would love to work on things that really matter. And why? Because they've told me that, all right? And that you can see, some progress within the next 5 years or something, that you're research has made an impact on human health or evaluating health products. So I believe that there's a great deal of interest in doing this. I just believe, number one, the money doesn't flow that way, and the evaluation and promotion systems aren't set up to recognize this. There's a fundamental bias against this type of endeavor, and you don't get Nobel Prizes for doing this either, okay? But that doesn't mean that I think people wouldn't participate in this if they were funded to do it, and if they were funded, then recognition systems would grow up, I believe, to recognize the contributions. I mean, these things like the organs on the chip and everything, they're marvels of technology and science. They need to be evaluated as far as what their performance is once you have devised them, right? Can they predict? Are they better than animal models and so forth? But you can't say they aren't of great interest to people, right? Including young, graduate students, and people would love to work on things like this. But they often don't have the opportunity because they're in this system that sort of isolates endeavors, scientific endeavors, into certain, little pods, so to speak. So I believe, I think this argument you guys are having is ill-placed. I think you need to think about human health and what we're trying to do. And the public sector wants to contribute, and the private sector wants to contribute. Okay, what they charge for their stuff is a different issue, I think, than how much the public, in my opinion, how much the public has, contributed at that remote area. The idea should be, like, how can we make this effective, this whole process? And what do we have to do to make this work for patients so that, 17 years, 34 years, okay, between discovery and actual final translation into the rural areas of the country? I mean, is that really right? But that's what Chris was presenting. So that's what I think. I know this symposium is structured around these different issues, but I really think then you're missing the main problem. Why is it so expensive? Like most, now maybe recently that isn't true, but usually, they can build an airplane by simulation and it will fly the first time, right? And so forth. They can build bridges and skyscrapers. They don't fall down 10 times, and then on the 11th time they finally get one that stands up. So we have to get this more like engineering than trial and error every time. So,
thank you for that. And I would love to take questions. So from the back of the room, and I'm pointing to you, sir, with glasses. Yep. Sorry. And since we have limited time, it would be great if you could, not you, but everyone, just make sure that your comment ends with a question mark.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. I don't know the hand symbol for question mark, but just on the question of patents, NIH linkage to patents, given that pharmaceutical companies, is it working? Nope. Yeah, given that pharmaceutical companies engage in a lot of legal chicanery to get patents, wouldn't it be interesting to do a reverse study to look at how many of those patents that you did link to an NIH grant actually got subsequently revoked or challenged? To see the value of these patents. Because you're only looking at Orange Book patents because they're deemed the most important, but we know that their portfolios are far greater, and they probably do cite some of those NIH works and patents as well. And many of those probably don't come into your study because they're not on the Orange Book, but they may get enforced in some litigation proceedings. So just trying to sort of unpack this a little bit more.
Any one of you?
Bob and I have had these conversations ad nauseum, so.
Yeah. I think it would be interesting to look at how these things fare in litigation. I'm pretty comfortable with using just the Orange Book for looking at small molecule drugs, because you don't, as far as I know, you don't see. We've looked at all patent challenges essentially, and it's very rare that a non-Orange Book patent is asserted in a paragraph 4 patent challenge. Very rare. There might be cases you can point to, but it's pretty rare that you see that. So I'm pretty comfortable looking there. I haven't looked at the extent to which a public sector patent patent is challenged and I mean, I know cases, but I haven't looked at the shares there. And I think, yeah, that's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing to do. That cite public sector patents. And, you know, actually, I think an interesting, right, and maybe this is where you're going, are some of those actually invalid in light of the public sector citation? And, you know, so I understand the question. Yeah, I was thinking about that last night with respect to the CDC patents. So, yeah, I think that's a useful thing to do. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think I hear your question is at the end of the day, we want to know something about the resulting quality of the drug and how much human suffering did we reduce as a result of all of this NIH funding, and the patent is a surrogate in that, for that.
Also the quality of innovation.
Yeah, yeah, yes.
So if I heard Chris Austin correctly, he said at the outset of his remarks that NIH doesn't have a role in drug pricing, but it has a very important role in reducing manufacturing costs. But then I heard Janet Woodcock say that NIH really does not have expertise in that area. So I'd like some clarification about the respective roles of the two agencies in making manufacturing more efficient, and in particular, is my surmise correct that this is very important for biologics, much more than for single or small molecule drugs?
Well, I can start. I think Chris was talking, if I missed part of your talk, but you're talking about the vectors for gene therapy and different things.
I was talking about the general idea of decreasing failure in adult use.
Oh, decreased failure rate, yeah. Manufacturing for small molecules, you know, we are working with multiple parties because the manufacture of small molecules is actually something people from the 1950s would recognize very clearly, all right? And it is very fraught with error and so forth, and doesn't, you know, potato chips, M&Ms, these things are manufactured in a continuous computer-controlled manner, whereas pharmaceuticals are not done that way. So small molecules, there's a huge effort to try and coax the industry into modern manufacturing techniques. On the biologic side, they early had more continuous because they were doing cell cultures and so forth. And the NIMBLE initiative that I mentioned is with NIST, is public-private partnership working on that to use more advanced techniques. Gene therapy and cell therapy, we're never going to get off the ground as a public health type of effort unless we get the cost of manufacturing the vectors and other products down. So no, and I would stand by my statement that NIH really, except for Chris, okay, NIH has no real expertise in manufacturing of drugs, biologics, so on.
Got it. Aaron.
So I thought that Dr. Woodcock made the great point about biomarkers and the important role that they play in drug development, and a lot of the calculations that were done leading to some of this work relates to patents on the drugs itself, and I was just wondering, you know, how you might assess the role that NIH-funded research plays in discovery of biomarkers and establishments of cell lines and vectors and other things that are critical to the drug development process, but then may not be reflected in the patents on the drugs themselves.
And Aaron, it's a great point. So you wouldn't expect those to be cited in the product patents on a drug because no, that's right. So we'll miss that in these types of analyses, even in thinking about the indirect effects. So I think it's an important point. Yeah.
Is there a way to try to assess those, or do you know, like? I haven't thought of one, but I think it's a very, very useful thing to be thinking about. Yeah, I mean, we could look empirically at the extent to which these things are cited, but because a lot of stuff ends up getting cited in a lot of these patents, the product patents on the drugs, and so it's possible that they would
they would cite some of the techniques just to be safe, or maybe to flood the patent office or something like that. I don't know. So it's something we could look at, and maybe the right way to do so, to answer your question, is take a handful of cases where we know qualitatively that these NIH-funded biomarkers and things like that have been important, and try to see if the patent record would reflect that, and if not, what might. So I think that's useful. And then I think just the publication analyses that are done by Clear et al. And things like that might pick those up as well. So, good question.
Yes. No.
There we go.
Next one. Go ahead.
I don't know if this is working.
Yep, it works.
All right, there we go. So we talked a little bit about how there is a valley of death, and transversing that valley of death requires infusions of capital. So the last time I checked, the NCAT's budget was less than 2% of the entire NIH budget. So that's 0.1. So we're really not actually traversing the valley of death using the NCAT's budget because it is so small. The second point, which I loved, was this idea of we need a lot of people and a lot of interdisciplinary expertise to traverse that valley of death. But yet, being collaborative really isn't that incentivized by NIH or tenure tracks. So how can the NIH step in that regard to creating the best team of teams, if you will, by providing both the capital and the incentivizing the structure of how promotions work or how grants are funded to actually make this a plausible moving forward?
Margaret, I'm going to ask you to take that question, and Dr. Austin, if you want to jump in after that, that would be terrific as well. You press the guy who's the little icon is the face.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've spent a fair amount of time looking at biomedical workforce-related issues, like you're talking about, more of that recently. And I think one of the things that's come up a lot. So during the NIH budget doubling, that had a really tremendous effect on the number of PhDs that were being produced. PhDs aren't even necessarily what you want in the lab when you have a very specific thing in mind. You don't want a whole bunch of PIs at the table. You want a bunch of people who can do the work, who can do the lab work. And so part of the discussion that ended up coming out of that as we started doing this modeling the biomedical workforce, which was actually an NIH U01 effort as well, is thinking about sort of these alternative pathways, alternative ways of training people, but then also, and Paula Stefan is one of the people who brought this idea up, was thinking about it more from a perspective of the end game for so many people has been an academic job. We know that post-2010, post the budget doubling, biomedical sciences PhDs aren't going into academia on average, right? And so given that that's the case, and also thinking about, well, what's the right way to go about stimulating science, one of the things that we've been thinking more about is, well, what about staff science jobs? Now, I mean, that's what the NCI intramural research is doing. It works for cancer drugs. It makes a lot of sense for cancer drugs because you've got that long timeline, you've got the high failure rates, you've got the possibility, though, of this particular molecule being potentially useful in a whole slew of different things that they can test for. It works well in that regard. What would happen if we scaled that up? If we allowed for more, federal labs, or use the DOE model, the GOCO's government-owned, contractor-operated sorts of labs, but having more staff scientists where you have more freedom to do that instead of this sort of R01-based sort of approach to the research.
Yeah. Dr. Austin, do you want to add something to that?
A couple things. First of all, thank you for pointing out the limitations of our budget. It's nice that someone else did that in addition to me, because it is, as you can see, the opportunity is huge. We're grateful for every dollar we get, but we try to be a force multiplier. But as Janet said, this has never been a core function, and I think it still stands. I think it's still true that culturally it isn't within the NIH, and this is a critical issue for us. And I actually worry about this a lot because we produce through our programs hundreds of trainees a year, and we know that the academic environment into which these people are going is not permissive for their promotion and tenuring. that's training malpractice. We're training people to go into an area where they know they can't flourish. So they will flourish if they go into pharma or biotech. But we actually lose those because there's nowhere to track them. We have solved this problem, as has been suggested, through the intramural program. At the NCATS intramural program, to give you a sense of this, we don't have PIs. We don't have tenure. We don't have tenure track. Everybody works in project teams. Every project is a collaboration with somebody somewhere in the world, and it works great. And the productivity is off scale. But the only reason we can do it is that we're not in a university. And organizations that have tried to copy this have just had difficulty within. If we tried to get all of the NIH to change to our model, that wouldn't have worked either. But I was able to do it because I control this little part. But departments so far haven't been able to do that. So one of the things we're working very hard on is the creation of academic departments of translational medicine that will have different promotion and tenure structures and different publishing requirements. As Janet said, you could spend 2 years doing optimization of a molecule in a very repetitive way, or getting bioavailability in a rat, and you're not going to get tenure on the basis of doing that, and yet you will not get a drug into people to cure a disease unless you do that work.
So Dr. Austin, can I ask you a follow-up? The departments of translational medicine that you hope to create will be funded by a mechanism that is outside relying on the advice of study sections, I assume?
No, we'd have...
Part of the problem is the study sections are incredibly narrow.
Yeah, they would have to be study sections that are funded by us initially, NCATS eventually. Yes, because I agree. If there was a source of NIH funding, then the ecosystem will evolve to be competitive to get that funding. But
so you need imaginative study sections. That's what I'm hearing.
Well, we would have to create our own, and we've done this already
Yeah.
within our own organization, because normal, biochemistry study sections don't understand the work that we do. There is a wrinkle that all of you should know that is for historical reasons. NCATS actually has no R program to speak of. We have no R01 program. It's one of the things that we're addressing that isn't key to this discussion, but it is key to this problem that we're the only institute or center at the NIH that can train people, but we can't support them in their career. And that's an artifact of our forming from 7 years ago that we need to fix.
That's a great point. Thank you. We've got 3 more people with questions, and we've got 8 minutes on the clock. So why don't I take your 3 questions, and then we'll try to answer all 3. So please.
I noticed that a lot of your research focused on disease-specific funding at NIH, and as you might be aware, congressional practice is generally not to reserve funds for certain diseases aside from the IC accounts, and to sort of let the study sections and different processes determine funding for diseases. And in some ways that's just sort of a developed norm, and I'm wondering if from your research you think that is best serving the public good, that sort of practice.
Great question. Yes, sir.
First of all, Chris, I want to commend you for recognizing the deficits of both translational science and also clinical science, which for a quarter century leaders have bemoaned MDs not learning how to do research other than big clinical trials. But really a question for Janet, having watched regulatory science with admiration for many years, and even before it was called that, when it's the work that led to PDUFA and things, we're ignoring in this discussion so much of the other structural issues that go into success, ranging from workforce issues to organizational behaviors to the funding for all the details to what's really rate limiting. No one's talked about the time and expense of recruiting patients to clinical trials. I'm sure it's on the chart Chris showed. But that frequently adds years to clinical trials and risk, because centers fail to attract patients. And I just wonder what we can learn from the FDA's experience to bring a truly transdisciplinary approach that includes organizational, financing, incentive issues to this problem?
Amit?
Hi, thank you all for great presentations. This is for Bob and Danielle and Margaret. It's just a question. You nicely outlined where you'd like to take your research. I'm just curious in terms of the availability of data, in terms of what the government can do. When we talk about clinicaltrials.gov, we talk about the NIH Reporter. How would you like to see those resources be augmented? What other databases would you like to be created if you had a wish list to get that evidence base of what the NIH's contribution actually is? Thanks.
So it turns out we don't have 8 minutes. My clock just jumped back up to 13. So this is how, I love this clock. So we've got 3 great questions. So you have lots of time to answer. Margaret, we'll start with you.
Okay, so just on the first question, I think was more just sort of a clarification. When I was speaking about disease-specific funding, what I was saying is, what I was referring to, the way that I was identifying that, it's entirely the investigator-initiated research project grants. I'm looking at their own grant abstracts and saying, do they mention one and only one disease? If they mention one and only one disease, or disease agent like Plasmodium falciparum or that sort of thing, then that was getting called disease specific. Part of what that was excluding was if you see a grant abstract or a proposal, and actually a lot of the intramural research has more of this flavor where they list off 12 different diseases that this might have particular relevance to. In that case, I wasn't treating it as disease-specific funding. But there are probabilistic, I actually have a separate publication that I didn't talk about that does more of the probabilistic sort of assignment, thinking about the other text that's in that proposal, what's the research that they're doing, and looking at the publications that resulted from it in case there was any sort of redirection of effort over that time to kind of get an idea for, okay, what was the actual emphasis of that research funding? So it wasn't so much thinking about it from the perspective of, what kind of direction might Congress be giving to NIH, but certainly, I guess, sort of thinking about from a policy perspective, would say we don't want to have that, given the sort of serendipity effects and that sort of thing, where there's not really evidence that doing a disease-specific push is going to have that much of an effect on the pharmaceutical industry, at least based on the current mechanisms or the mechanisms that we've historically had in place for doing that. Now, we're such an effort to go through translational science as opposed to basic science R01s, that sort of thing. That might be a completely different story, but that wasn't the mechanism that I was looking at.
Thank you. Dr. Woodcock?
Well, thanks for asking that question. The question is, what can we do culturally, sort of sociologically, what could really move the dial? We could do it. We have the tools now. We can set up disease-focused trials rather than individual trials around the inventions. We can seek continuous improvement of disease over time, right? Rather than, ask this question about this drug and this device and this thing. We could seek to improve patient outcomes every year so that people are getting better and better. And I've gotten so frustrated by this, I've gone to patient groups who really get this, okay? And they are trying to set up platform trials in their diseases and then you don't have the startup costs, you have control groups, you can study biomarkers, you can subset patients in these diseases, and then you can slot in these inventions as they come through. You can do experimental medicine because you have the substrate there. I think, but it's just cultural. It's totally, we've done it this way all this time, and this is how we're going to keep doing it, right? And I hope that the passion of some patient groups drives them to be able to achieve this, because then when people see that it's possible to really focus on improving the disease, which after all is what we're supposed to be doing, right? Then we can get others to join into this effort. But right now, the various sectors, medical, biomedical research, pharmaceutical industry, they're all in their ruts, and they aren't going to change unless somebody else gives an example.
Great.
Let me take the data question. So I think if you're trying to understand what is the impact of, say, NIH money, there are components to that. One is, how do you spend that money? So how do you select who gets grants? And so is that done efficiently? Can that be done better? The second is conditional on who you're giving money to. How do you create incentives? How do you make sure so that the impact of getting that money goes further? And so on both of these things, there's a lot of open questions, and there's a lot of data that I've actually find myself wishing I had. So on the selection end, NIH, since I know you're in the room, it would be great to have Impact 2 available in a restricted data access center so that people can use that information, like along with Census, IRS. There's lots of government organizations that provide their data in ways that, so researchers would submit proposals, you can evaluate it, decide whether or not you want to support that proposal, that they then have access to the data in a restricted way. And I think that would get a lot of people on board in terms of doing research. So I have a couple papers using NIH data. I get emails very frequently from young grad students who are really excited about this area, and they say, hey, can I use this data? I have so many interesting questions. And I say, I can't give it to you. Here's the website, good luck. And I haven't heard back from them. And I think that's like a lot of capital that's being lost in that world. In terms of further selection things, I think there's issues about how, there's a lot of information happening in these study sections in terms of trying to decide of people sort of thinking. So there's like individual scores, there's the variance in the scores. Oftentimes right now we have access just to the final aggregated score, but there's potentially a lot of information in like, when people disagree, does that mean, how does that predict kind of, risky research versus non-risky? There's just like a lot of information that you have that if you collected it could be useful in terms of just like predictive analysis. On the sort of the treatment end, so what is the impact of funding, kind of conditional on giving people the money? Drug prices would be great. IMS likes to take money, large amounts of money for their drug price data. Having some information about rebates so that we know the true price of drugs, especially innovative drugs, that would be really useful. And anything we can kind of do in terms of kind of measuring kind of clinical value added of specific drugs. So for instance, in the UK, at least they have NICE, where you can kind of think about, some measure of that. To the extent that we could do that domestically would be great as well. And then finally, actually, one last thing, which is not about data. You can have all the data in the world, but we're still going to have issues about causality and about sort of proper inference. And so to the extent that, if organizations are thinking about, let's try doing things a new way, let's try to be experimental, structuring that in a way that it can be evaluated so we can see whether or not, if we decide to give out grants in this particular manner or in that other particular manner, having a control group and being kind of well set up to sort of do kind of A/B testing within the government, that would be extremely useful.
Thank you. Bhavin, you want to add something? Yeah.
Yeah. So everything Danielle said, plus a few things also on the data question. And I want to focus mainly on a different set of issues, those related to tech transfer and BIDOL and things like that. So, I've been banging my head against this kind of problem for a long time, as I think Amit, here are three things that I think would be useful. I mean, actually, I think some experimentation would be useful too in terms of licensing and things like that, but I don't think that's going to happen, but it might be great if it would. No, in some sense, it might happen more on the grant side than it would on the tech transfer side, but that's just my sense. Three data points. One is, I think it would be useful if we had something like an orange book for biologic drugs. Okay, fine.
I'm sure it'd be useful.
Oh yeah, no, okay, fair enough. No, fair enough. I don't know, right? I don't know who's in this room, right? So, okay. Second, this is to the NIH people. We heard this story about the reasonable pricing clauses and the credits. Like, it would be really useful to formally evaluate that. I've heard those stories as well, and they sound right. What would be really useful would be a way to provide in a sort of anonymized way to, some information on licensing of intramural and extramural inventions, so that we can kind of just exploit these sorts of experiments. I think that would be a very, very useful thing to do. And then finally, and maybe most controversially, what a drug costs to develop. We talked about Tufts. It's kind of a metaphysical question. Maybe it's a hard question. I think if we could just get some information, and again, I don't know how one would anonymize it, but the costs of clinical trials for publicly funded drugs. So for the drugs where I see that direct effect, exactly what is the pharmaceutical company doing and how much are they paying? I think that might allow us to get some traction on some of the policy questions that have vexed at least me and I think a lot of us for many years.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you very much. We're breaking for lunch. We'll come back at 1 o'clock and hopefully our panelists will linger so that you can all visit with them. Thank you.